"Excuse me, miss, but are you absolutely sure you're in the right cabin?" "Economy is toward the back." The words hung in the chilled air of the first-class cabin, heavy with condescension and unearned authority. Naomi didn't even look up from her iPad. She had just spent 72 grueling hours dissecting the bloated, failing financials of this very airline. Now, a red-faced executive and a complicit flight attendant were trying to publicly humiliate her, demanding to see her boarding pass for the third time. What they didn't know, what they were about to find out in the most devastating way possible, was that by trying to kick her off the flight, they were effectively signing their own termination papers. The rain was coming down in sideways sheets against the massive plate glass windows of Chicago O'Hare International Airport, blurring the lights of the tarmac into a smeared palette of neon orange and runway blue. For Naomi Sinclair, the dreary weather was a perfect reflection of her mood. At 38, Naomi was a senior partner at Vanguard Capital Group, one of the most ruthless and effective private equity firms in the Western Hemisphere. She was brilliant, meticulous, and exhausted. For the past 3 days, Naomi had been locked in a windowless conference room in downtown Chicago, leading a team of forensic accountants through the rotting financial guts of Meridian Airlines. Meridian was a legacy carrier, once a titan of the skies, now hemorrhaging cash due to bloated management, archaic operational structures, and a toxic corporate culture that alienated its customer base. Vanguard Capital had quietly purchased a controlling share of Meridian's distressed debt. Next Tuesday, the restructuring would become public. Meridian would effectively belong to Vanguard, and Naomi Sinclair was the architect of the buyout. She was the one holding the scalpel, deciding which executives would stay and which departments would be gutted to save the airline from total liquidation. But tonight she was just a passenger trying to get home to London. Boarding Flight 48 to London Heathrow had been a chaotic mess, another glaring symptom of Meridian's operational failures. When first class was finally called, Naomi gathered her leather tote bag and made her way down the jet bridge. She was dressed in what her colleagues called her stealth armor, a beautifully tailored charcoal cashmere sweater, wide-leg wool trousers, and pristine white loafers. It was an outfit that whispered wealth rather than shouting it, designed for comfort during the 8-hour transatlantic crossing. She stepped onto the aircraft, welcomed by the forced, tired smile of a junior flight attendant. Naomi turned left, moving into the exclusive first-class cabin, a spacious sanctuary of lie-flat pods upholstered in navy blue leather. She found her seat 2A, a window seat, and stowed her small carry-on in the overhead bin. Sinking into the plush leather, she let out a long, slow breath. The hardest part of the week was over. All she had to do now was drink a glass of sparkling water, put on her noise-canceling headphones, and sleep until they touched down at Heathrow. She pulled out her iPad to review a few final clauses in the Meridian restructuring agreement, highlighting sections regarding the severance packages of the current executive board. The numbers were staggering. The sheer audacity of the airline's leadership to pay themselves millions while the company burned was infuriating. Then the tranquility of the cabin was shattered. "You've got to be kidding me. Tell them to hold the doors. I am not missing this flight because of some incompetent gate agent," a booming, arrogant voice echoed from the front of the cabin. Naomi didn't look up, used to the tantrums of entitled travelers. The voice belonged to Bradley Whitmore. Bradley was a regional vice president of a mid-tier logistics company, but to hear him tell it, he was a master of the universe. He was a man who measured his self-worth by the color of the plastic loyalty card in his wallet. He was a global Diamond Elite flyer on Meridian Airlines, a status he wielded like a broadsword. He wore a loud, pinstriped bespoke suit that was a bit too tight across his midsection, his face flushed with the exertion of rushing through the airport. Bradley stomped down the aisle of the first-class cabin, complaining loudly into his phone while simultaneously expecting the flight attendants to part like the Red Sea. He reached row 2. His boarding pass clearly stated to be the aisle seat right next to Naomi's pod. He stopped dead in his tracks. He lowered his phone slowly, his eyes fixing on Naomi. Naomi, a black woman quietly reviewing documents on an iPad, did not fit Bradley Whitmore's narrow, prejudiced worldview of what a first-class passenger on a transatlantic flight should look like. In his mind, this cabin was a private country club, reserved for older white executives in suits. Bradley ended his phone call abruptly, slipping the device into his breast pocket. He stood in the aisle, blocking the flow of boarding traffic behind him, and stared at Naomi. He didn't say, "Excuse me." He didn't offer a polite nod. Instead, he scowled, his eyes darting from Naomi to the seat number placard above her head and then back to her. "Excuse me," Bradley barked, his tone devoid of any basic courtesy. Naomi paused her reading. She looked up, her expression neutral, her eyes cool and guarded. "Yes? I think you're in the wrong seat," Bradley said, not phrasing it as a question but as a statement of fact. "This is first class." Naomi held his gaze for a second longer than was comfortable. She had experienced this specific brand of microaggression more times than she could count throughout her career. It was the immediate assumption of out-of-placeness, the automatic presumption of poverty, of lower status, of a mistake having been made. Usually she would politely correct the person and move on, brushing off the annoyance. But tonight she was exhausted, and she was currently holding the financial lifeblood of this man's favorite airline in her hands. "I am aware of what cabin this is," Naomi replied evenly, her voice a smooth, calm contrast to his aggressive bark. She broke eye contact and looked back down at her iPad. "And I am in the correct seat." Bradley's face darkened. His ego, fragile and entirely dependent on the deference of others, could not handle being dismissed so casually. He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping into a sneer. "Are you absolutely sure about that?" "Because my colleague Mr. Henderson was supposed to be upgraded to 2A. They told him at the lounge that the seat was taken, but clearly there's been some sort of system error. Economy is toward the back." Naomi slowly locked her iPad and placed it on the console. She turned her head, fixing Bradley with a stare that had notoriously made hardened Wall Street bankers sweat. "Mr. Whitmore, I assume?" Ricand, she said, reading the name tag on his oversized carry-on bag. "I am in seat 2A. My ticket is confirmed. I suggest you stow your luggage and take your seat in 2B so the rest of the passengers can board. You are blocking the aisle." Bradley stood completely still, his jaw working as he processed her dismissal. He looked around, seeking an ally, and his eyes locked onto the senior flight attendant marching down the aisle. We'll see about that," Bradley muttered under his breath. The senior purser on Flight 48 was a woman named Linda Garrison. Linda had been flying for Meridian Airlines for 25 years. She was a veteran of the skies, but years of dealing with Meridian's declining standards, coupled with the airline's strict mandate to bend over backwards for elite status members at all costs, had severely warped her professional judgment. Linda had survived rounds of layoffs by knowing exactly whose boots to lick and whose complaints to prioritize. "Mr. Whitmore, so wonderful to have you flying with us again," Linda beamed as she approached, her customer service smile tightly stretched across her face. She practically ignored Naomi, focusing entirely on the red-faced executive in the aisle. "Can I take your coat, sir? Get you a pre-departure beverage?" Linda, it's good to see you." Good to see you," Bradley said, his voice dripping with forced camaraderie. He purposely pitched his volume up so the surrounding passengers could hear. "Listen, there's been a massive screw-up at the gate. As usual, my colleague Henderson is stuck back in business class, and I was told this seat, 2A, was taken by a paying passenger. But it seems someone got lost on their way to coach." He gestured vaguely toward Naomi, who was sitting quietly, watching the interaction with the detached, analytical eye of an auditor, observing a failing business practice. Linda finally turned her attention to Naomi. Her smile vanished, replaced by a tight professional mask that barely concealed her sudden suspicion. To Linda, Bradley Whitmore was a known quantity, a high-revenue passenger who complained to corporate if his walnuts were too cold. Naomi Sinclair, despite her expensive clothing and composed demeanor, was an unknown variable. And in Linda's biased, tired mind, the wealthy white businessman's word carried significantly more weight than the quiet black woman sitting next to him. "Excuse me, miss," Linda said, leaning over Bradley's seat to speak to Naomi. "May I see your boarding pass, please?" Naomi raised an eyebrow. "Is there a problem with the flight manifest?" We just need to verify that you are in the correct cabin, ma'am." "Ma'am," Linda said, her tone patronizing. "Sometimes passengers get confused by the seating layout." Naomi felt the familiar hot prickle of anger at the base of her neck, but she didn't let it reach her face. She knew exactly what was happening. She wasn't just being asked to show her ticket. She was being asked to justify her existence in a space they believed she hadn't earned. Without a word, Naomi picked up her phone, unlocked it, and pulled up her digital boarding pass. She held it out. Linda leaned in and squinted at the screen. The screen clearly displayed the Meridian Airlines logo, the flight number, and in large bold letters, NAOM is Sinclair, CA2A, first class. Linda blinked, clearly surprised, but she recovered quickly. She handed the phone back. "Thank you, Miss Sinclair. It appears you are in the right seat." She turned to Bradley, offering an apologetic shrug. "I'm sorry, Mr. Whitmore, but she is manifested for this seat. It looks like Mr. Henderson will have to remain in business class." Bradley's face went from pink to a dangerous shade of crimson. "That is unacceptable, Linda. You know as well as I do how these things happen. People use standby buddy passes or they exploit glitches in the ticketing app. My company spends $500,000 a year with Meridian. I am a Global Diamond member. First class is supposed to be for paying customers, not people gaming the system." He pointed a thick, accusatory finger at Naomi. "I want you to verify her fare class. I guarantee you she's an employee friend flying non-rev, and according to your own airline's policy, revenue passengers take priority over non-revenue flyers for first-class upgrades. Bump her to the back and bring Henderson up." Ashat. It was a breathtaking display of entitlement and racism disguised as corporate policy. Bradley was actively fabricating a scenario to justify stripping Naomi of her seat simply because he couldn't stomach sitting next to her. Naomi turned her head slowly, fixing Bradley with a stare so cold it could have frozen the jet fuel in the wings. "Mr. Whitmore," Naomi said, her voice carrying a lethal, quiet authority that immediately silenced the surrounding chatter in the cabin. "I do not work for this airline. I'm not flying on a buddy pass. I paid for this seat, and if you point your finger at me one more time, you will find out very quickly that my tolerance for disrespect is considerably lower than my credit limit." The cabin went dead silent. A passenger across the aisle pretended to be deeply engrossed in a magazine, though his eyes were wide. Bradley scoffed, though he quickly lowered his hand. "Are you threatening me?" "Linda, did you hear that? She just threatened a Diamond member. See?" Linda, caught between a wealthy, irate frequent flyer and a passenger who refused to be bullied, made the absolute worst possible choice. She chose the path of least resistance for herself, falling back on the ingrained, prejudiced protocols of a failing company. "Shh! Miss Sinclair, please lower your voice," Linda reprimanded, completely ignoring the fact that Bradley had been yelling for the past 5 minutes. "Mr. Whitmore is a valued customer, and he does bring up a valid point regarding our security protocols. Given the discrepancy with Mr. Henderson's upgrade list, I am going to have to ask you for further verification." Harmay stared at the flight attendant, genuinely astonished by the sheer incompetence. "Further verification? You just looked at my boarding pass." "Pass? A digital pass can be easily faked, Mom," Linda said. her voice taking on a strict authoritative edge, emboldened by Bradley's presence. "I need to see a physical government-issued photo ID. And I need to ask you to gather your things and step into the front galley with me so we can clear this up without disturbing the rest of the first-class passengers." She was treating Naomi like a criminal. She was attempting to isolate her, to pull her out of her seat, to physically assert control over the situation. Naomi didn't move. She didn't reach for her bag. She sat perfectly still, her mind racing. She was no longer just an annoyed passenger. She was Naomi Sinclair, senior partner at Vanguard Capital, and she was currently experiencing firsthand the exact systemic rot she had been hired to excise from this company. "No," Naomi said simply. Linda blinked. Excuse me?" I said. "No, Linda. I am not moving to the galley. I am not gathering my things. If you have a question about my identity, you can look at my ID right here in front of Mr. Whitmore, since he is apparently so deeply invested in the auditing of your passenger manifest," wrote. Naomi reached into her tote bag, pulled out her sleek black leather passport wallet, and extracted her United States passport. She snapped it open and held it up directly in front of Linda's face. "Naomi Sinclair," she read aloud, enunciating every syllable. "Born in New York. You will find it matches the boarding pass exactly." Linda Garrison stared at the passport, her eyes scanning the photograph and the name. It was undeniable. A heavy, awkward silence descended upon row 2. Linda swallowed hard, a flicker of doubt finally crossing her face. She had overstepped, and somewhere deep down she knew it. But the presence of Bradley Whitmore looming over her shoulder like an expectant gargoyle kept her from backing down. "Well," Bradley demanded, peering over Linda's shoulder, trying to get a look at the passport. "Does it match or not? Check the fare class code on your tablet, Linda. I bet it's an X or an N. Stand by." Linda pulled her company-issued tablet from her apron pocket. Her finger trembled slightly as she tapped Naomi's seat number. The screen populated with Naomi's flight data. Linda's eyes widened a fraction of an inch. The fare class wasn't an X per standby. It wasn't even a standard discounted first-class ticket. It was a J-class ticket, a full fare, unrestricted, premium cabin ticket purchased at the highest possible price point. Furthermore, beneath Naomi's name was a small red flag icon. In Meridian's system, a red flag usually indicated a VIP politician, a celebrity, or a high-level corporate executive whose company had a massive contract with the airline. Linda realized she had made a terrible mistake. She looked up at Naomi, the patronizing strictness vanishing from her face, replaced by a sudden, pale panic. "Miss Sinclair, I apologize for the inconvenience," Linda stammered, her voice suddenly an octave higher. "Your credentials are, of course, perfectly in order. Please enjoy the flight." She tried to hand the passport back quickly, hoping to bury the interaction, but Naomi didn't take it immediately. She let Linda hold it for a few agonizing seconds longer, letting the flight attendant sweat under her unyielding gaze. Finally, Naomi plucked the passport from Linda's fingers. "Thank you, Linda," Naomi said softly. "I will be sure to document this interaction. I find it fascinating how Meridian Airlines handles its customer service protocols." Bradley, completely oblivious to the shift in Linda's demeanor or the gravity of the situation, exploded. "You're just going to let her sit there?" Bradley shouted, completely abandoning any pretense of corporate civility. "She was rude to me. She threatened me. I am a Global Diamond member, Linda. I am telling you, I want her moved, or I want off this plane, and I am taking my company's entire corporate account to Delta." It was a bluff, of course. Men like Bradley Whitmore never actually walked away from the status they had spent years accumulating. But in the fragile ecosystem of a failing airline, a threat to pull a corporate account was usually enough to make a flight crew panic. Linda, whose brain was currently short-circuiting between the VIP flag on Naomi's profile and Bradley's screaming, completely lost control of the cabin. Mr. Whitmore, please, she is a paying passenger. Linda tried to placate him, but Bradley pushed past her, stepping aggressively into Naomi's personal space. Listen to me, you arrogant. Bradley started, his finger pointing directly at Naomi's face. Before he could finish the insult, Naomi stood up. She was only 5'7" in her loafers, significantly shorter than Bradley's bulky frame, but the sheer force of her presence made him physically take a step back. She didn't yell. She didn't raise her hands. She simply radiated absolute, untouchable authority. Let me make something exceptionally clear to you, Mr. Whitmore, Naomi said, her voice a low, terrifying hum that carried perfectly in the quiet cabin. You are not going to speak to me again for the duration of this flight. You are not going to look at me. You're going to sit in seat 2B. You're going to drink whatever cheap scotch they serve you. And you're going to keep your mouth shut. Because if you say one more word to me, I will make it my personal mission to ensure you are placed on a federal no-fly list before we even reach the Atlantic Ocean. Bradley's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. He looked at Linda, expecting her to intervene, to defend him, to call the police. But Linda was paralyzed. Linda, Naomi snapped, not looking away from Bradley. Mr. Whitmore is causing a disturbance and threatening a passenger. According to Federal Aviation Administration regulations, you are required to deplane him if he cannot comply with crew instructions and maintain basic decorum. Oh, so just... Bradley barked a harsh, disbelieving laugh. Deplane me? They aren't going to deplane me. I'm the victim here. Linda, go get the captain. Better yet, get the gate agent. Get security. I want this woman off the plane right now. She is unhinged. A murmur ran through the first-class cabin. Several passengers were now holding up their phones, the tiny red lights indicating they were recording the altercation. Linda, utterly out of her depth, backed away toward the galley intercom. I have to call the captain. I have to call the ground supervisor. Do that, Linda, Naomi commanded, her voice ringing with absolute certainty. Call the ground supervisor. Call airport security. In fact, while you're on the phone with the ground team, why don't you have them patch you through to corporate? Call Howard Trent. Linda froze with her hand on the intercom receiver. Howard Trent was the current CEO of Meridian Airlines. Bradley sneered. Oh, listen to her. She thinks she knows the CEO? You're pathetic. You're just trying to scare them. Naomi ignored Bradley completely. She kept her eyes locked on Linda. Call Howard Trent. Linda, tell him that Naomi Sinclair from Vanguard Capital is sitting in 2A on flight 408 out of a hair. Tell him that a Global Diamond member is demanding my removal, and that his senior purser is attempting to comply. Ask Howard if he thinks that's a good idea, given that Vanguard Capital is currently underwriting the $2 billion restructuring loan that is keeping this airline out of Chapter 11 bankruptcy. I would love to hear his thoughts on how you treat your first-class passengers. The words hung in the air, heavy and lethal. The silence in the cabin was so absolute you could hear the rain pelting the fuselage outside. Linda's tablet slipped from her hands and clattered loudly against the galley floor. She didn't even bend down to pick it up. The color drained from her face completely, leaving her looking sickly and old. She finally understood what the red VIP flag meant. She hadn't just insulted a wealthy passenger, she had actively harassed the woman who practically owned the airplane they were standing on. Bradley, however, was not a man who understood subtext, nor did he possess the financial literacy to comprehend what Naomi had just said. Vanguard what? Who cares? Bradley yelled, looking around the cabin for validation and finding only horrified stares from the other passengers. She's bluffing. Call security, Linda. Get her off. But Linda wasn't moving. She was staring at Naomi with abject terror. I'll do it myself, Bradley snarled. He reached past Linda into the galley, grabbing the intercom phone off its hook, and pressed the button for the flight deck. Captain, we have an aggressive stowaway in first class. We need airport police at the door immediately. Naomi slowly sat back down in her seat. She picked up her iPad, unlocked it, and pulled up her email. She began drafting a new message. To legal@vanguardcap.com, executive board at meridianair.com, subject immediate termination directives, flight 408 incident. Let them call the police, let them call the ground crew. The trap was sprung, and Naomi was ready to watch the entire corrupt structure of Meridian Airlines burn down around Bradley Whitmore's ears. The 10 minutes it took for airport security to arrive felt like an eternity suspended in the chilled, recycled air of the first-class cabin. The heavy drumming of the rain against the fuselage was the only sound masking the nervous whispers of the other passengers. The entire cabin had ground to a halt. No one was reading, no one was sleeping. They were all captivated by the standoff in row 2. Bradley Whitmore paced the narrow aisle, a restless, angry energy radiating from his flushed face. He had convinced himself he was the victim, aggressively nursing his bruised ego. Every few minutes he would shoot a venomous glare at Naomi, waiting for her to crack, waiting for the facade of her calm demeanor to shatter. "You're making a massive mistake," Bradley muttered to her, his voice tight. "You think you can just throw around the CEO's name and scare everyone? I play golf with regional directors. People like you people who gain the system. You always fold when the police show up." Naomi Sinclair didn't even blink. She sat gracefully in 2A, her iPad resting on her lap, having just hit send on the emails that would permanently alter the executive structure of Meridian Airlines. She didn't offer Bradley a response. Engaging with a man so entirely out of his depth was a waste of her cognitive resources. She simply waited. At the front of the cabin, Linda Garrison looked physically ill. The senior purser had retreated into the galley, her back pressed against the beverage carts. She hadn't dared to use the intercom again. The devastating realization of what she had just done was slowly paralyzing her. She had let her own ingrained biases and the bullying of a frequent flyer blind her to basic airline policy, and in doing so she had insulted the financial grim reaper of her own company. Heavy, deliberate footsteps echoed down the jet bridge. "Here we go," Bradley said, a cruel, triumphant smile spreading across his face. He adjusted his bespoke suit jacket, readying himself to play the aggrieved VIP. 2 armed Chicago Department of Aviation police officers stepped onto the aircraft. They were imposing figures, their dark blue uniforms dripping with rain, utility belts heavy with equipment. Right behind them was a woman in the sharp navy blazer holding a 2-way radio and an iPad. Valerie Reynolds, the Meridian Airlines ground operations shift manager for Terminal 3. The captain, a silver-haired veteran who had emerged from the flight deck upon hearing the commotion, met them at the door. "What's the situation, Valerie?" "My purser is hyperventilating in the galley." Bradley didn't let the shift manager answer. He shoved his way past the bulkhead and inserted himself right into the middle of the authority figures. "Officers, thank God," Bradley boomed, pointing a thick finger back toward Naomi. "That woman right there in 2A. She has been aggressive. She has threatened my physical safety, and she is refusing to follow crew member instructions. I want her removed from this aircraft immediately. And I want a report filed." The 2 police officers looked at Bradley, their expressions entirely neutral, and then looked past him toward row 2. Valerie Reynolds, however, didn't look at Bradley at all. Her eyes were wide, scanning the first-class cabin with absolute panic until they locked onto Naomi Sinclair. Valerie had just received an emergency overriding phone call from the airline's Global Operations Center in Dallas. The call hadn't come from a regional manager. It had come directly from the executive floor. "Excuse me, sir. Step aside, please," Valerie said, her voice shaking slightly. She didn't wait for Bradley to move. She physically brushed past him, practically sprinting down the short aisle until she reached Naomi's seat. Bradley scoffed, turning to follow her, fully expecting Valerie to demand Naomi's ID and drag her off the plane. Instead, Valerie stopped at seat 2A, clutching her tablet to her chest like a shield. She looked at Naomi, her face pale, and spoke in a tone of such profound, trembling deference that the entire cabin fell completely silent. "Miss Sinclair?" Valerie asked, her voice cracking. "Naomi Sinclair of Vanguard Capital." Naomi finally looked up from her iPad. "Yes. Are you the ground supervisor?" "Yes, ma'am. Valerie Reynolds." "Miss Sinclair, I don't even know what to say. I have our CEO, Howard Trent, on line one of my secure comms. He is asking to speak with you immediately." Valerie held out a heavy black corporate radio handset, her hand visibly shaking. "He said it's a matter of absolute urgency." The triumphant smile vanished from Bradley Whitmore's face, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated shock. The color drained from his cheeks. He looked at the radio, then at the terrified shift manager, and finally at Naomi. The reality of the situation was crashing down on him like a physical weight. She wasn't bluffing. She wasn't a standby passenger. Naomi took the radio handset. She didn't gloat. She didn't look at Bradley. Her focus was entirely business. She pressed the transmit button. "Howard, it's Naomi." A frantic, deeply apologetic voice crackled through the speaker, loud enough for the first few rows to hear. "Naomi, my God, I am so incredibly sorry. The operations desk just flagged my private line. I was told there was a seating dispute involving you and an elite member. Please tell me my crew did not attempt to remove you from that aircraft." "Not only did they attempt it, Howard," Naomi said, her voice a calm, lethal blade. "Your senior purser, Linda, actively colluded with a harassing passenger to demand my physical identification after verifying my digital boarding pass. She then attempted to isolate me in the galley to force me off the plane, simply because this man," she finally gestured lazily toward Bradley, "decided I did not look like I belonged in first class. Naomi, I am terminating her immediately. I am pulling her off that flight right now," the CEO pleaded, the desperation in his voice echoing through the cabin. Meridian Airlines was weeks away from missing payroll. Naomi's signature was the only thing preventing the company from being chopped up and sold for parts. "Please do not let this isolated incident reflect on the restructuring agreement." "It's not an isolated incident, Howard. It's systemic. It's exactly the kind of toxic, sycophantic, operational culture we spent the last 3 days discussing," Naomi replied smoothly. "You have a staff that values the aggressive entitlement of a single loyalty member over federal regulations, basic human decency, and common sense. I sent an email to your board 3 minutes ago. I'm adding a clause to our restructuring terms. Overhaul of customer-facing training protocols effective immediately, and Linda Garrison is not flying today." "Agreed. Done." "But whatever you need," the CEO said without a second of hesitation. "Is the passenger who harassed you still on the plane?" Naomi finally turned her head and locked eyes with Bradley. The man looked like he was going to be physically sick. He was backing away slowly, bumping into the armrests of the seats behind him. "Yes, Howard, he is," Naomi said. "Put Valerie back on," the CEO commanded. Naomi handed the radio back to the shift manager. Valerie pressed the button. "Yes, Mr. Trent." "Valerie, deplane that passenger immediately. Revoke his flight privileges, and have Linda pack her bags and exit the aircraft. The first officer will act as the relief purser if needed, but get them both off my airplane right now." "Yes, sir," Valerie said, her voice tight. She handed the radio to one of the police officers and turned to face the aisle. The atmosphere in the cabin had shifted from tense anxiety to absolute stunned awe. The passengers were witnessing a public execution of entitlement, orchestrated by a woman who hadn't even needed to raise her voice. Valerie walked up to Bradley Whitmore. "Sir, you need to gather your belongings. You are being removed from this flight." "Now, talk. Now, Dan." You can't do this." Bradley stammered, his voice lacking any of its previous booming authority. It was a high, reedy whine. "I am a global diamond elite. I spend hundreds of thousands of dollars." Naomi cut him off. She didn't yell. She simply projected her voice perfectly. "You don't spend anything, Mr. Whitmore," Naomi stated, her eyes locked onto his. "Your company, Apex Freight Solutions, spends that money. You just reap the benefits of the corporate travel account. And since I am the senior partner overseeing the private equity portfolio that recently acquired a 30% stake in Apex Freight's parent company, I am intimately aware of your corporate expenses." Bradley stopped breathing. His jaw dropped. The fragile world he had built, constructed entirely of loyalty points and perceived superiority, was disintegrating into dust. "I know your CEO, Richard," Naomi continued, her tone conversational but laced with absolute ruin. "I'll be calling him when I land in London. I think Richard will be deeply disappointed to hear that his regional vice president is using company travel time to racially profile and harass female executives on commercial flights. It's a massive liability. I imagine your diamond status will be the least of your concerns by Monday morning." Bradley looked wildly around the cabin. He looked at the passengers who were now openly glaring at him. He looked at the police officers whose hands were resting near their utility belts, waiting for a reason to assist him off the plane physically. He had no allies. He had no power. He had picked a fight with a woman purely based on his own prejudiced assumptions, and he had unwittingly attacked a titan. "Officers," Valerie Reynolds said firmly, gesturing to Bradley, "please escort Mr. Whitmore off the aircraft. His ticket has been cancelled." "I'll sue," Bradley whispered, but there was no conviction in it. He was a broken man. "Move it, sir," the larger of the two police officers said, stepping forward and placing a heavy hand on Bradley's shoulder. Defeated, humiliated, and shaking with a mix of rage and terror, Bradley reached up and violently yanked his oversized carry-on from the overhead bin. He didn't look at Naomi again. Halpala. He kept his eyes glued to the floor as the police officers marched him down the aisle of first class, past the bulkhead, and out onto the jet bridge. As Bradley disappeared, Valerie Reynolds turned her attention to the galley. Linda Garrison was leaning against the counter, her face buried in her hands, weeping silently. Her uniform, once a symbol of her seniority, now just looked like a costume she had outgrown. "Linda, grab your bags," Valerie said, her voice devoid of sympathy. "You're done." "Captain, we are pulling her off. I'll get a reserve flight attendant down here in 10 minutes, so you don't miss your departure slot." Linda didn't argue. She knew it was over. 25 years of service, erased in 10 minutes because she decided to cater to a bully. She pulled her rolling suitcase from the galley closet, keeping her head down. As she walked past row 2, she paused for a fraction of a second, opening her mouth as if to apologize to Naomi. Naomi didn't even look up. She had already moved on. She was back on her iPad reviewing a spreadsheet. To Naomi, Linda was no longer a person. She was a solved operational inefficiency. Linda swallowed her words, lowered her head, and dragged her suitcase off the plane. The heavy aircraft door remained open, the cold Chicago air rushing in, clearing the stifling tension that had choked the cabin. Valerie Reynolds stood by the bulkhead, ensuring the manifest was updated. Slowly, almost hesitantly, a man sitting in seat 3F, a white-haired gentleman in a tweed jacket, began to clap. It was a slow, deliberate applause. Within seconds, the woman across the aisle joined in. Then another passenger. Soon the entire first-class cabin was applauding. It wasn't a raucous cheer. It was a respectful, deeply satisfied acknowledgement of karma being served with surgical precision. Naomi finally looked up from her iPad. She looked around the cabin, a very small, genuine smile touching the corners of her mouth. She offered a polite single nod to the man in 3F, acknowledging their support, before returning to her work. 10 minutes later, the aircraft doors were sealed. The engines whined as they spooled up, pushing Flight 408 back from the gate. As the plane taxied through the driving rain toward the runway, Naomi reached for her glass of sparkling water. She took a slow sip, put on her noise-canceling headphones, and closed her eyes. The flight to London was going to be incredibly peaceful. The weekend had been a blur of frantic, humiliating phone calls for Bradley Whitmore. After being unceremoniously escorted out of O'Hare International Airport by armed police, he had been forced to purchase a deeply discounted middle seat on a budget carrier just to get back to Denver. He spent the entire miserable, cramped flight trying to convince himself that the situation was salvageable. Naomi Sinclair was just one partner at Vanguard Capital. Surely a massive private equity firm wouldn't concern itself with a minor squabble over an airline seat. He told himself he would buy his CEO, Richard, an expensive bottle of scotch, laugh off the incident as a misunderstanding with an overly sensitive passenger, and it would all blow over. But at 8 a.m. on Monday, the reality of his situation violently fractured his delusions. Bradley pulled his leased Mercedes into the executive parking garage of Apex Freight Solutions in downtown Denver. He grabbed his briefcase, smoothed his tie, and marched toward the private elevator. He swiped his badge against the security reader. A harsh red light blinked. ACCES denied. He frowned, swiping it again, harder this time. ACCES denied. Having trouble, Mr. Whitmore. Bradley turned to see two men standing by the elevator bank. They weren't from the usual lobby security team. They wore dark suits and earpieces, their expressions grim. Next to them stood Brenda, the cold-eyed director of human resources. "Brenda, my badge isn't working," Bradley said, forcing a chuckle that sounded more like a choke. "System glitch." "There is no glitch, Bradley," Brenda said, her voice entirely devoid of warmth. "Please hand over the badge and your company phone and the keys to the corporate vehicle." Panic, icy and sharp, finally pierced Bradley's arrogance. "What? Brenda, you can't be serious. I need to see Richard immediately. This is about their ridiculous misunderstanding on the flight, isn't it? I can explain everything to Richard." "Richard doesn't want to see you," Brenda replied, extending a manicured hand. In fact, Richard spent his entire Sunday on a crisis management call with the legal team from Vanguard Capital. "We received a formal grievance, accompanied by sworn statements from the flight crew of Meridian Airlines and the Chicago Aviation Police." Bradley swallowed hard, his throat dry. It was blown out of proportion. "She provoked me. She is the senior partner managing the private equity fund that owns 30% of our parent company, Bradley." Brenda snapped, her professional veneer cracking to reveal genuine anger. "She didn't provoke you. You racially profiled her. You publicly harassed her. You demanded her removal from a flight because you didn't think she belonged in first class. And you did it while aggressively brandishing the Apex Freight corporate account as a weapon." Brenda took a step closer, lowering her voice to a lethal hiss. "Do you have any idea how much liability you have exposed us to? Vanguard Capital was scheduled to greenlight a massive expansion loan for us this week. Now everything is frozen pending a full audit of our corporate culture and executive conduct." Bradley felt the blood drain from his face. The marble floor of the lobby seemed to tilt beneath his feet. The swaggering entremate was finally crystallizing. He hadn't just insulted a wealthy woman, he had actively jeopardized the future of his entire company. I have tenure. I have contracts," Bradley stammered, grasping at straws. "You can't just terminate me without cause." "My legal team. Your employment contract contains a standard morality and corporate reputation clause," Brenda interrupted smoothly. "A clause you violated the moment the police escorted you off that aircraft for causing a disturbance. You are terminated for cause, effective immediately. There will be no severance. Your health insurance expires at the end of the month. Furthermore, the company is reviewing our legal options regarding the damage you've caused to our relationship with Vanguard Capital." The two security guards stepped forward, boxing Bradley in. "Now?" Brenda said, her hand still outstretched. "The badge, the phone, the keys." The keys. With trembling hands, Bradley reached into his pockets. He handed over the plastic badge that had defined his entire identity. He surrendered the company's smartphone. He dropped the keys to the Mercedes into Brenda's palm. "We have couriered your personal belongings from your desk to your home address," Brenda informed him. "You are officially trespassed from all Apex Freight properties. If you attempt to contact Richard or any other executive, we will file a restraining order. Goodbye, Bradley." He stood there in the lobby, stripped of his title, his perks, and his dignity. The man who had boasted about his global diamond elite status just 48 hours prior was now unemployed, facing potential legal ruin, and didn't even have a ride home. As he turned and walked out through the revolving doors into the cold Denver morning, Bradley Whitmore finally understood the devastating power of the woman in Seat 2A. 6 months later, the landscape of commercial aviation had shifted dramatically. In a high-rise office in London, Naomi Sinclair sat at the head of a massive mahogany conference table, reviewing the third-quarter financial reports for Meridian Airlines. The numbers were not just good, they were miraculous. The impending bankruptcy that had loomed over the airline like a storm cloud had completely dissipated. The restructuring, guided by Naomi's iron will, had been brutal but necessary. Vanguard Capital had gutted the bloated executive board, retaining only Howard Trent, the CEO, but placing him on a remarkably short leash with strictly performance-based compensation. But the most profound changes hadn't been in the accounting department. They had been in the cabin. Naomi had leveraged her personal experience on Flight 408 to completely rewrite Meridian's operational rulebook. The incident had exposed a toxic corporate rota culture that empowered sycophantic employees to appease entitled elites at the expense of basic human decency and federal regulations. Linda Garrison's termination had sent a shockwave through the entire company. When Linda had attempted to appeal her firing through her union, Vanguard's legal team had simply presented the audio recording from the flight deck communications and the written police report. The appeal was dropped within 24 hours. Linda, after 25 years of service, found herself unceremoniously out of the industry, a cautionary tale whispered in galleys across the fleet. In the aftermath, Naomi had mandated sweeping, aggressive retraining for all customer-facing staff. The directive was absolute de-escalation over appeasement, equality over status. The unspoken rule that high-tier frequent flyers could act with impunity was burned to the ground. Flight crews were explicitly empowered to deny boarding or remove any passenger regardless of their fare class or loyalty tier who displayed abusive, discriminatory, or harassing behavior. The aviation press had initially predicted disaster. Industry analysts claimed that stripping the elite flyers of their untouchable status would cause a mass exodus of high-revenue corporate clients to rival airlines. They were wrong. Instead, a fascinating shift occurred. While a small fraction of the most demanding toxic passengers did leave, they were quickly replaced by a massive influx of new customers. Word spread that Meridian Airlines was no longer a hostile environment. Businesswomen, minority executives, and families who had previously avoided the legacy carrier due to its archaic, elitist reputation suddenly found a welcoming, strictly professional environment. By prioritizing a safe, respectful cabin for everyone, Meridian accidentally created the most desirable first-class product in the sky. The atmosphere on board their flights transformed from a tense country club to a quiet, efficient sanctuary. The yield on premium cabin sales is up 22% year-over-year, a junior analyst reported, breaking the silence in the London conference room. It appears the new behavioral policies haven't deterred corporate bookings at all. In fact, our customer satisfaction scores in first and business have hit a 10-year high. That knock. Naomi nodded slowly, her eyes scanning the data. It was exactly as she had predicted. Most people, even wealthy executives, didn't actually want to fly with men like Bradley Whitmore. They wanted peace, quiet, and competence. By removing the bullies and the enablers, Vanguard had unlocked the airline's true value. Her phone buzzed on the table. It was a message from Howard Trent. Naomi, just reviewing the Q3 numbers. Incredible work. The board is thrilled. Also, I wanted to personally thank you again. The culture here is night and day. You saved this airline. Naomi locked her phone. a small, satisfied smile touching her lips. She hadn't set out to be a crusader for airline etiquette. She had simply wanted to read her iPad in peace, but she was a woman who demanded efficiency and abhorred structural stupidity. The entitlement of Bradley Whitmore and the complicity of Linda Garrison were inefficiencies that had to be eradicated. She closed the financial dossier and stood up, smoothing the front of her tailored jacket. The restructuring was complete. Meridian Airlines was saved, its toxic culture excised with surgical precision. As she walked out of the conference room looking out of the London skyline, Naomi knew she would be flying back to Chicago next week for a new acquisition. She also knew exactly which airline she would be taking, and she knew with absolute certainty that no one would dare ask to see her boarding pass twice. The spectacular downfall of Bradley Whitmore and the firing of Linda Garrison serve as a stark reminder that true power rarely needs to shout. Bradley's fatal mistake was assuming that his corporate loyalty card made him superior, blinding him to the fact that the quiet, composed black woman sitting next to him was the very person orchestrating the survival of his company and the airline he claimed to own. Naomi Sinclair didn't just win a petty argument. She systematically dismantled a toxic culture, enacted sweeping corporate reform, and proved that entitlement is a remarkably fragile armor against actual undeniable leverage. In the end, the bullies lost their platforms. The airline was saved by the very passenger it tried to reject, and karma was served at 30,000 feet. If you enjoyed this deeply satisfying story of corporate karma and hard-hitting justice, please like this video, share it with anyone who hates airplane entitlement, and subscribe to the channel for more incredible stories of real-life power dynamics and dramatic twists.